Ultimately, some scholars have tried to place the two figures in opposition because they suggest that Zia's Islamization of Pakistan was more of a top-down process aimed at changing the laws rather than reforming society, whereas Maududi was seen as advocating a bottom-up process in such a way that he believed that the people had to become more Islamic. So ultimately, they believed that the problems of modernity were due to a lack of faith, particularly in Islam. Therefore, the Islamization process was necessary as the solution or panacea. And finally, this had to involve a return to Islamic principles. But in contrast to what Western scholars have often suggested, this was not to be at the expense of the positives of modernity. Maududi and Zia also inherently felt that Islamization didn't necessarily have to lead. Scholars have tried to assert that Maududi directly influenced the objectives resolution. The first declaration that it met was that sovereignty belongs to Allah and elected representatives only have a limited role to play. And I discovered that the justification given for this ordinance was given by the regime in a pamphlet written in 1985, and this was called Qadiani's Threat to Islamic Solidarity. My second major argument, which is that Islamization of Pakistan can be better understood within the context of Maududi's theological ideas. Specifically, in terms of the Islamization of Pakistan under Zia, both Zia spoke of the Islamization of Pakistan and Maududi also spoke of the Muslimization of Pakistan. And he, in February 1948, talked about a three-step procedure to Muslimize Pakistan. So they used similar language. Ultimately, some scholars have tried to place the two figures in opposition because they suggest that Zia's Islamization of Pakistan was more of a top-down process aimed at changing the laws rather than reforming society, whereas Maududi was seen as advocating a bottom-up process in such a way that he believed that the people had to become more Islamic before wider society could be reformed. But I ultimately suggest that this dichotomy isn't entirely accurate. Ultimately, there were times when Zia advocated a bottom-up as well as a top-down process of Islamization. Similarly, there were times when Maududi talked about the need for a top-down process. He would state that ultimately, once a country accepts sovereignty of God, then it is necessary for the state to use what is at its disposal to achieve the full Islamization. Moreover, they also had comparable anti-colonial rationales for Islamization. So ultimately, they believed that the problems of modernity were due to a lack of faith, particularly in Islam. Therefore, the Islamization process was necessary as the solution or panacea. And finally, this had to involve a return to Islamic principles. But in contrast to what Western scholars have often suggested, this was not to be at the expense of the positives of modernity. So they believed a good Muslim leader would have to have knowledge of contemporary events and politics, and also that technology could be kind of positive as long as it aligned with the straight path of Islam. Maududi and Zia also inherently felt that Islamization didn't necessarily have to lead to sectarianism. Indeed, they believed that, for example, the 1980 Zakat and Usher Ordinance would not cause a sectarian dispute. But of course, this was not the case, as was seen by the widespread backlash among the Shia community and the consequent need for a U-turn by the Zia regime. So I have two kind of main examples in my doctoral thesis about situating Islamization within Maududi's theological ideas. So the first one is the objectives resolution. And while, of course, this was adopted in 1949, so a long time before Zia came to power, it was actually made substantive under Zia in 1985, which means that it was made a legally enforceable part of the constitution. And Zia had already acknowledged the importance of the objectives resolution because he believed it was through that Islam came to occupy a pivotal position in Pakistan. I've also mentioned the significance of the Provisional Constitution Order 1981 for linking the Objectives Resolution with the country's kind of ideological basis. And ultimately, scholars have tried to assert that Maududi directly influenced the Objectives Resolution. I couldn't find any evidence to that effect, so I've taken a slightly different approach, which is that we can at least understand the clauses of the Objectives Resolution and the need for it in the context of Maududi's theological ideas. Stated in February 1948, Maududi talked about a three-step Islamization process that was needed in Pakistan, and he suggested that the first step had to involve the Constituent Assembly making 4 declarations. Ultimately, the Objectives Resolution met 2 of these, so we can see how it aligns with his theological ideas. The first declaration that it met was that sovereignty belongs to Allah and elected representatives only have a limited role to play. And secondly, that the state cannot transgress the limits of Islam. Ultimately, as well, there were 2 kind of key theological similarities between the text of the Objectives Resolution and Maududi's wider theological thoughts. And this is really important then to contextualize the Objectives Resolution in this thought, because certainly at least minority members of the Constituent Assembly at the time that the Objectives Resolution was introduced in 1949 did not fully understand some of the clauses of the Objectives Resolution. And even some Muslims probably didn't fully grasp the significance. And so this is why isolated steps towards Islamization prior to Zia should be contextualized within a wider theological thought in which kind of these steps make sense. So the first key kind of theological similarity I look into is the idea that sovereignty belongs to Allah and that elected representatives only have a limited role to play as his vice-regents. And secondly, how Muslims must be free to live according to Islamic principles and actually be enabled to live according to them. And then finally, with regards to the Objectives Resolution, its significance in terms of Maududi is really clear from the fact that his political organization, the Jamaat-e-Islami, used the Objectives Resolution as a benchmark by which to judge the progress of Islamization prior to the Zia regime. So when the Objectives Resolution was introduced, the Constituent Assembly also established the Basic Principles Committee, and this was meant to report on the main principles on which the Constitution was supposed to be based. But ultimately, it released its first report in 1950, and a significant member of the Jamaat-e-Islami and translator of Maududi's works, Rashid Ahmad, described the first report as a gross and flagrant betrayal of the Objectives Resolution. And this was because it had made the Objectives Resolution subject to fundamental rights. Secondly, part of the reason why the Jamaat-e-Islami accepted the first constitution in 1956 was because it included the Objectives Resolution as a preamble to the constitution. And of course, the Objectives Resolution acknowledged God's sovereignty, and for the Jamaat-e-Islami, this ended 200 years of disbelief. And then moving on to my second main example of the need to situate Islamization in Maududi's ideas is the fact that I found some direct evidence that Zia's Islamization was directly influenced by Maududi. So in 1984, we of course had the criminalisation of the Ahmadiyya community through an ordinance which added sections 298B and 298C to offences relating to religion, which meant that if the Ahmadis posed as Muslims, they could be fined or imprisoned. And I discovered that the justification given for this ordinance was given by the regime in a pamphlet written in 1985, and this was called Qadiani's Threat to Islamic Solidarity, Measures to Prohibit Anti-Islamic Activities. But when I was reading this pamphlet, I was struck by the fact that a lot of the material seemed familiar, and I eventually realized that it's because a significant section of the pamphlet written by the Zia regime plagiarizes another pamphlet written by Maududi called the Qadiani Problem. And the Qadiani Problem was an English language pamphlet published in 1979, but it was the English version of the Qadiani Masala written in 1953 in the context of the 1953 anti-Ahmadi riots. So ultimately, this, for me, and it hasn't been discussed prior to my work, this was the first main example of direct influence of Maududi on Zia's Islamization of Pakistan. Ultimately, the fact that the Zia regime plagiarized and didn't acknowledge Maududi is, of course, intellectually dishonest, but it also probably reflects how the Zia regime did not want to give the Jamaat-e-Islami too much influence and credit for its ideas. And of course, by the time the Zia regime wrote this pamphlet in 1985, that would have been 5 or 6 years after Maududi had passed away. So this is likely one reason why no one has picked up on the fact that there's a direct influence of Maududi here. And then moving on to my third major argument, it's that Zia's Islamization was not only influenced by Maududi, but by British colonial thought and practice. But this wasn't just in a one-dimensional sense that he resisted colonialism, which, as I mentioned, he did in the context of his anti-colonial rationale for Islamization. In this, Zia attributed socioeconomic injustices to materialism, which in turn had bred colonialism, which of course is apparent from the fact that the British came to pre-partition India as the East India Company. Ultimately, then, Islamization was presented as a kind of panacea to materialism and colonialism. However, the contradiction in this was the fact that the Zia regime actually perpetuated colonial thought and practice, and I provide 3 main examples. So, like the British, the Zia regime took advantage of an undemocratic environment to make sweeping legal changes. Because my thesis was focused on religious minorities, I particularly was interested in offences relating to religion in the Pakistan penal codes, and 4 out of the 5 offences added by Zia were made through ordinances, which was when the constitution was being held in abeyance, and thus were not acts of parliament, and thus can't be seen as a legal change that was made with the mandate of the people. My second main example is that the Zia regime maintains colonial-era offences relating to religion, but it also perpetuated colonial-era language. So generally, the sections of offences relating to religion added by Zia are contrasted with the colonial-era sections because Zia's protected only Islam and Muslims. But if you look at the language of some of the sections added by Zia, for example, 298A and 298C, these talk about the concept of religious feelings, which is the same language that was used in the colonial era sections. And there's a really good book that I kind of referenced here in my thesis by J. Barton Scott called Slandering the Sacred. And he talks about how the British were attempting to educate the people through offences relating to religion as part of its so-called civilizing mission, but that ultimately it educated the people in outrage. And I think this is true in the case of Pakistan, because we can see how these offences have been misused to settle personal disputes. And my third example of how the Zia regime perpetuated colonial thought and practice was how Zia criminalised groups he considered a threat to his authority and ideology, just as the British did, such as through the Criminal Tribes Act. And the particular example I use in the case of Zia is, of course, the Ahmadiyya community. And moving on to my fourth and final argument, this was that Zia's Islamization had a lasting impact on religious minorities. So ultimately, I suggest that the ill-defined place of religious minorities under Zia was not new. This was essentially a part of the Objectives Resolution because it established a hierarchy between Muslims and non-Muslims. Muslims were enabled to live according to Islamic teachings, whereas non-Muslims only had adequate provision to profess and practice their religion, which of course is a very vague statement. But ultimately, when you look at Zia's speeches about the Islamization process, they're quite vague as to what this would mean for non-Muslims, beside the fact that they would have certain exemptions from Islamic law. But his commitment to religious freedom, obviously has to be doubted. In 1985, when he revived the constitution, Zia didn't state this officially in the Ordinance, but he removed the word freely from a clause of the Objectives Resolution, which initially read as, and I quote, "Adequate provision shall be made for the minorities freely to profess and practice their religions and develop their cultures," end quote. So this again leads us to problematize Zia's attempts to associate himself with Jinnah, as Jinnah had said unequivocally in 1947, this removal of the word freely undermines this freedom. So another example of the lasting impact on religious minorities is the fact that minorities have been disproportionately accused of offences relating to religion. There was some really interesting research by Kaiser Julius who suggested that even though Muslims are still most likely to be accused of offences relating to religion, if you separate the category of Muslims into Sunni and Shia, then a majority of those accused would then be Shia. He also suggested that the kind of exponential increase in accusations of offences relating to religion after the Zia regime showed how the issue of so-called blasphemy wasn't a particularly significant one prior to the Zia regime. And of course, in the modern day, it's widely asserted, and rightly so, that these offences are often used to settle personal disputes, especially against religious minorities. And then the final kind of major lasting impact on religious minorities of Zia's Islamization was, of course, the criminalisation of the Ahmadiyya community. And I've kind of separated this impact into direct and indirect impacts. So in terms of the direct impact, we had, after the criminalisation, the relocation of the Ahmadi leader and headquarters to the UK, which also affected wider migration patterns of the Ahmadiyya community out of Pakistan, particularly to the UK, but other parts of the world as well. Another direct impact was how these sections have been more widely interpreted to prohibit further actions which are seen as posing as Muslims. So, for example, prohibiting Ahmadis from engaging in Qurbani, as we saw around the time of Eid, but also prohibition on the use of Islamic motifs on places of worship and on their graves. So this has repeatedly seen the destruction of minarets on Ahmadiyya places of worship, and also desecration of Ahmadi graves that use the kalima, or the declaration of Islamic faith. And then in terms of the indirect impacts of the criminalisation, we've seen the further emboldening of anti-Ahmadi sentiment. So Maududi was particularly significant, as influenced by Iqbal, in presenting Ahmadis as both un-Islamic and disloyal to Pakistan. So we can see how this remains two kind of concepts in public discourse. We've also seen how further anti-Ahmadi legislation has been adopted after the criminalisation. So belief in Hatami Nabuwat, or the finality of prophethood, is necessary now in order to be nominated to the Senate as of 1985, to get married in Punjab as of 2022, and also to obtain a passport. And a final indirect impact is how now concessions to anti-Ahmadi pressure groups, particularly the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, the TLP, how the government often feels that because this is such a sensitive issue, it has to concede to such groups who engage in sit-ins or use other forms of pressure to get their way. And there's two particularly good examples of this in 2017 and in 2023 as well. And finally then, the criminalisation of the Ahmadiyya community also confirms Article 20 of the Constitution, which states that religious freedom is subject to public order, law and morality. Therefore, as per the Constitution, religious freedom is not like a fundamental concept in the sense that it's an absolute right. Rather, it is subject to other considerations. And we can see this in the fact that the authorities often justify concessions to such anti-Ahmadi pressure groups as a means of maintaining public order, because they know that these groups will engage in disorder. So giving in to their demands is seen as the lesser evil effectively. But of course, then we see how the rights of the Ahmadiyya community are sacrificed in order to maintain the public order. So just to kind of finalize my talk, my kind of major argument in my thesis is that Zia's Islamization of Pakistan and its lasting impact on religious minorities has to be better understood in the context of Maududi's theological ideas, but also in the context of colonial thought and practice. And as is stated at the end of a PhD, I'm looking to what's next as a result of this research, and I'm hoping in the future I'll have the opportunity to work on an Islamic liberation theology as a kind of indigenous alternative to Zia's Islamization of Pakistan. But I'm very grateful to the team at New Wave History for having me to speak on my PhD thesis today, and I hope that you got something out of it. Thank you so much.